by letting go of the fact that things have to look very pretty, it empowers programmers to just make things happen. If everything looks fancy, usually it creates a little more friction to create things. I think if you start from the angle of say, I want to contribute to this project, you're not going to find the right problem to solve. I think it's better when you when you start from your own problems. I think the need and the desire to contribute will come from your actual real life experience of stumbling on something. When your code is used by people, it becomes harder to change it. But there's many lower level things that I've been meaning to change for 10 years I haven't done yet.
My idea would be to start a little bit about programming in general. How did you got into programming? What did you learn from? What did you find useful? What would you recommend to other people to use to learn programming in general? And then we're like launch 100% into Dear ImGui and talk like forever about it, because I've seen your notes. Like there's gonna be like 5 hours. I mean, practically
Cool.
Probably 2 hours, but
Okay, we'll see.
Okay, so now tell me, how did you start programming?
So how did I start programming? It was a long time ago. So I'm born in 1980, and back then when you got a computer, I got my computer when I was 12 years old, and it was with MS-DOS 4.0. So when you boot DOS, you've got this kind of like terminal thing, and one of my friends showed up one day after school, and at some point I think he started learning BASIC through his friends, through his uncle, I think, and he brought this Quick Basic book. It was not Quick Basic actually; it was GW Basic, which was the BASIC that was shipped with DOS 4, and I sort of started toying with programming then with him, but then we were 12. He had this book. I don't think I've seen this book again. I just saw it the first day. So I guess I got very basic kind of like programming concept that we've been exploring together. But I think from the age of 12 to 16, I always kind of like tried to learn programming by myself, but I didn't really have access to many books, or I didn't understand them, or resources were in English. It was like this kind of 4 years where I was trying to learn by myself, but not making, heaps of progress. I would go to the kind of the public library and kind of like Xerox a lot of books about BASIC and then Pascal.
Oh yeah.
But I didn't really understand what I was doing, to be fair, right? I was just toying and making small things happening. I think my first try of progress was in 95, so I was 15 years old, and I made a little game that we ended up playing with my friends. And I think there was a computer shop in front of the school, and the game was basically a Tron clone, right? Just kind of like in the game Tron, which is kind of top-down view where you just direct a little line and you have to avoid colliding with each other. It was a multiplayer, 4-player Tron game with kind of like many kind of like options and dialogue and storylines and stuff like that. It was it was kind of teenage, things. But actually, it was played, right? We were actually playing it at the computer store, and it's like I got sort of my first taste of making things that kind of like had users of some sort, right? But I guess I'm sort of self-taught in that way. And then when I was 18, I went to a computer school, computer engineering school called Epitech in Paris, France. And I sort of learned programming a little more formally back then, but then, it was a school where we didn't have many teachers, to be honest. It was the kind of school where they would throw you into a project and you have to make things happen, and you have to figure out how to make things happen.
Sounds okay.
Yeah, it was, but I don't feel like I ever kind of learned programming sort of like the right way. Or I never had many theoretical class, or I didn't listen to them. Right? I think I probably like read like 2 or 3 programming book in my life, and the last one was probably like 20 years ago. So I sort of like grabbed it from experience, from trying to make things happen, and reading blog posts and stuff like that. But I feel like I never like paid attention enough to learn the great theory of programming, like, whatever. And because of this, there's many kind of algorithm and data structure that I sort of like intuitively I can use them or I can make them happen from out of first principle, but I don't know their name or I don't know the design pattern. I don't know how things are called or what kind of like grown-up programmers do things.
Okay.
I just do things my own way. So I guess I'm self-taught from that era where the computer was leading you to program in a way, because you had the best basic prompt available very easily. And so it's very different from today's, right? I guess today, if you want to do programming, you have to very proactively seek stuff and seek that knowledge. And the world is so different with the internet now that I can't kind of like really understand or begin to give advice how to learn it today. But I guess the my main advice for people would be just make things that you find useful and that you have use for, and you will end up making something that might be useful for others, right?
So how did you got introduced to C then? Through what? Through people?
I think it was the natural. At that point, I started learning Basic and then Pascal, and then I guess my first kind of ship program was in Pascal. And then I don't remember how I was hanging out on BBSs, which was kind of like not pre-internet because internet existed, but at the time people used to connect to kind of local networks. That was kind of like a way to kind of exchange. They were like um, messaging system, right? And we used to hang out on kind of like programming messaging system. Um, I think back then I was mostly playing games. I wasn't very paying attention a lot, but I guess C was just a natural kind of like evolution to Pascal. I don't remember what was the reason back then, but I was just starting doing things in C. And my first C programs, I had no idea what I was doing, right? I didn't understand pointers because I never used pointers in Pascal. Pascal had pointer, but I never used them. It was like, it was just moving steadily toward achieving the things, but I sort of learned on my own. I don't remember the reason. I guess I had back then that C was just better or more powerful or faster or something, and I just went through it, but I don't remember the reason.
Okay. So how did you then find yourself at Media Molecule?
So that's a long time later.
Okay.
There's like 15 years between schools and Media Molecule, I think. Um, it was my fourth job in the game industry was Media Molecule. I think before that I was working in Japan in a company called Q Games in Kyoto. And we used to do a series of games called the Pixel Junk series on the PS3, which was kind of like early, kind of like they were PSN title at the time, was sort of the Xbox Live Arcade started in 2006, and then PSN followed, and it was sort of the first wave of indie titles. And I worked on a game called Pixel Junk Shooter there, and this is also where I discovered kind of the ImGui principle, and we can discuss this later. And then after I left this company, Media Molecule, I remember I wanted to leave Japan and go back to France. And I remember at that point, I sort of wanted to learn mathematics for some reason because I always felt I had like zero knowledge about, physics and science and math, and if I have to do any kind of physics programming or even basic stuff, I'm kind of lost. And I wanted to learn mathematics, but then at some point I saw this company and I liked what they're doing, and I guess I applied to them. Initially, so one of my friend knew Dave Smith from Media Molecule, and I emailed them directly, and I never got an answer. So 3 months later, I just assumed that Media Molecule didn't want me, and then I moved back to France. And then eventually, I forgot how, but I got in contact again with them, and I interviewed, and and got a job there. So eventually, I stayed like 2 months in France, and I moved back to the UK after that.
And why
So
did you go to Japan in the first place?
I was, I guess I was one of those kids playing lots of old console games, and I was obsessed with kind of like um, making games in Japan. Uh, I was a Sega fanboy. I really wanted to work at Sega. I think the first thing I did when I landed in Japan in 2003 as a kind of holiday was actually to knock at the front door of a Sega studio that I really liked.
Oh,
It
really?
was a studio called United Gaming Artists, owned by Sega, and they made a game called Rez. I don't know if you played Rez. So I landed on the plane, I dropped my luggage, and I knocked at the front door with like chocolates and a bottle of wine, saying, "Hey, please hire me. Can you hire me?" Right? And it was something like 8 p.m. But I actually opened the door, and the studio was almost full of people because it's Japan, so 8 p.m. Everybody's there. And I ended up in the boss Mizuguchi-san office for like an hour. He was just talking about life and stuff. And he told me, hey, learn Japanese and come back. Basically, he implied that. And after that, um, I started making a game in France, and while making the game, I started learning Japanese. Right? And by the time I learned enough Japanese, that company United Gaming Artists was disbanded, or they weren't making great games anymore, or something. I don't know exactly. And I applied to Q Games,
Okay.
which was the sort of the other company that I liked in Japan, which was kind of a small indie studio, maybe 50 people making smallish 2D HD game I liked.
Could you speak
But so
Japanese then?
yeah,
Like, did you learn Japanese enough to speak?
yeah, I learned Japanese. I learned Japanese in France mostly. Yeah, I can speak some Japanese. I mean, it's not
Okay.
excellent, but I can kind of survive in Japan. And so I lived in Japan 3 years then.
Okay.
And then that was 2008 to 2011. In 2011, I was at Media Molecule.
So when you said you discovered immediate mode GUI there at Q Games, in what way it happened?
So just as I arrived, I think the new game called Pixel Shooter was just started development, and they had this. Basically, they had a very very basic editor where you could, I think, place objects. It was the beginning of the game, and it was basically made in a kind of ImGui API. And the story is that the first game of the series called Pixel Junk Racers was programmed by a guy called Atman Binstock, who used to work at RAD, and I think he used to be friend with Casey Muratori. So I guess it was probably around that time where Casey kind of explored Angry Principle, and Atman made his own kind of like implementation of the API. So I landed this company. I think it's three programmers, and we had to make the tools for the game. Um, and because I always used to make tools, even before I used to make, I always worked in game that had a lot of editing tools, even quite early on. Uh, I guess de facto I became the person to work on the game editor, and I wanted to improve that library, which was very simple at the time. It was basically buttons, sliders, windows. Um, I forgot what else, um, but I just started improving this thing. And for example, one thing I remember is that when I added a text edit control to the library, I didn't have one back then. Um, it it felt very powerful, very very fast. Like before that, people had to select object in very long list and go to like page 5 and to find an object to place in the game or whatever. And I just had a little filters using the keyboard, and I forgot how long it was to create the text edit control, but it wasn't too long, less than a day maybe. And then it became very powerful, and then people started filtering stuff, and then just the productivity of the level designer, you know, became 30% faster overnight. And this is what I like about making tools is that when you make your custom tools, you can just I like looking at designers, level designers, game designers, and just, trying to find, hey, where are they stuck? Where are they sort of wasting time doing this and that? How can I help them? Uh, and uh, so I worked on this UI, and I remember the first time I used it, I thought it was weird. I didn't know, you know. I think at the time, 2008, few people were kind of exposed to this kind of ImGui paradigm. I remember it was weird. It was certainly very ugly in the sense that the visual output of the library was really, really ugly back then in that library. Um, but eventually I got acquainted to it. And then the next project I worked on, it was called, back then it was called Pixel Junk Lifelike. It was sort of kind of arty fartsy music visualizing thing that turned into kind of like a music sequencing thing with the PlayStation Move. And I worked on this thing with an artist, but the artist's bion wasn't there so much. I would just show up on Thursday evening, and say, "Oh, make it more blue or whatever," and then leave the room to have a smoke or whatever. So basically, I felt a little left alone without kind of sort of design direction. And I think back then I never sort of like took a strong lead on the direction because it was an artist-driven project basically. So I ended up procrastinating and making many tools. And by making many tools, I sort of like expanded on the ImGui implementation I had then. And I explored many concepts. How can I do kind of plotting? How can I do, I don't know, tree nodes, or I don't know. I just kept adding features to the editor as a way to procrastinate because I was lacking sort of like a general design direction. Um, and I ended up making a full kind of debugger for the scripting language the company was using and making a lot of fancy tools that ended up staying many years. So that was my exposure to the sort of the IMG paradigm. And then later, a few years later at Media Molecule, when I was working on Tearaway, I arrived on Tearaway, and I think when I arrive in the room, there's like four people in the room kind of experimenting with what the game would become. And the game has changed a lot because when you start a game, you don't know where it's going. And a guy started, initially, there was the game editor was running on the Vita. Initially, I think the game only ran on the Vita. And so the person who started making a tool immediately on day one, and he made this kind of like very OPP UI system with templatey, uh, templatey. It was touch based. It had lots of inheritance, but he already owned this kind of part of the project, and I sort of didn't like it, but I, I went along with it, and there was many other things to do, and eventually I didn't touch the game editor a lot. But then I think 2 years down the line, um, the game became bigger, the game became more complex, and it was hard to debug. And I think at that point there was one person dedicated to maintaining the editor, basically the UI system, which was very complex and very templatey and crazy. And I was very frustrated that I couldn't add my debug tools very easily. So I think it was Christmas 2012, I started writing a kind of like a UE library. It wasn't library back then, it was just for the game, right? Um, and I sort of rewrote something that was based on what I learned from Q games, right? So Q game was Atman Beanstalk library. It was called ImGui actually, simple ImGui. And I started to write something that I didn't give it a name. I just called it ImGui, and I sort of wrote something out of memory based on what I remember from that thing, and use it on Tearaway. And I started adding a lot of tools, and it worked very well. The game got complex at that point, and then other people started adding tools. Um, so it started there basically. And then after Tearaway was finished, we started working on Dreams, and I ported the library to Dreams. And basically, and initially I just ported it. There were two different engines. So Tearaway team was a very different sort of team than Dreams was. Very different engine. it was just a different set of people, so to speak. So I ported it to, I forked it and made it work on Dreams. And when I left the company later, Alex told me, if you want, you can kind of take this library with you. But it wasn't library back then. It was like there was one version in Dreams, there was one version in Tearaway, and both of them were sort of hardwired to use the specific engine. So there was the font system from Dreams, the font system from Tearaway, all kind of stuff. So I spent a few months trying to sort of extract it of both game and trying to kind of like create an abstraction that would work for everyone. And actually, Anton, who you interviewed a few weeks ago, was there. I was working on Dream with him, and he was one of my earliest tester. So the aim was that how can I make it that he can use ImGui, dear ImGui in his own project? And I sort of tried to devise this kind of like abstraction scheme where you could plug your own renderer and feed inputs and stuff like that. And eventually it became shared code. I don't remember exactly, but it was eventually it became a library at media molecule that was used by both kind of Tearaway and Dreams. And then I was able to sort of like fully extract it and make it standalone library.
So you first made it work both on Tearaway and Dreams as a library before you made it like sort of extracted it out.
I think so. Yeah, I think it seems like the natural path because it was literally a fork. It was literally like I copied it from Tearaway to Dreams and modified it and improved it. I guess I forgot how I did it, but I probably looked at the diff between them and tried to kind of extract that and design an abstraction layer. And Anton and another person, Stefan, were kind of like early adopters in their own code base. And so I basically had four code bases, Tearaway and Dreams, and Anton code base, and Stefan code base, and it was sort of like enough feedback to find an abstraction that would work for all four people, right? And it sort of became this the the version 1 library that was released.
When did the name happen?
So initially when I released it, it was August 2014. It was called ImGui. It didn't have a name, right? It's like, you release a compiler and you call it compiler or something. Because I didn't think about it as a product or anything. I was happy to sort of like extract it. And at that point, my expectation was that, hey, at least I'm gonna be able to use that on my own project, but I didn't think about branding it. But then it sort of became slightly popular, and at this point, I felt I was stuck because I kind of stole the acronym. It was called, the namespace was called ImGui, and I opened a thread, a topic to discuss finding a name for it. And there's kind of discussion between programmers suggesting name like, ImGui plus plus or OMGui or whatever. But I think I disliked the name ImGui back then already because it felt like a very kind of like cryptic acronym that's hard to pronounce, that's very highly technical. So I sort of added a dear, sort of a cute way to give it personality. And I remember when I proposed that in topic was I came up with that idea and everybody thought it was a joke and everybody disliked it, but I thought it was memorable in some way. And I think some people dislike it even now. But my point, I had to keep ImGui in the title because the namespace was already called ImGui on all the flags and all the enums. So I felt I couldn't sort of like remove that from the title. Maybe I could because it was in 2015. I could have called something else and rename everything, but I guess I just didn't do that. So I added the prefix. It became Dear ImGui. But it wasn't. It was basically a patch to an existing name that I didn't really plan out.
Yeah. Yeah, initially when I was learning about ImGui, I thought Dear ImGui is like all of the ImGui that we know of. Like Dear ImGui is like everything that we know about immediate mode GUI. Like this is the same thing.
It's very confusing. I'm very sorry that it got very confusing for people because many people are sort of conflating my library and the principal, and I feel regretful and sorry that I sort of hijacked the acronym. That's also why I've been sort of like relentlessly asking people to call it Dear ImGui just in order to avoid this kind of like ambiguity, but it's just, people just keep calling it
It's
ImGui.
an uphill battle
Uh,
to
I
remind
used
people.
to, I created a Twitter account solely dedicated to kind of pointing out that it's called Dear ImGui when people say ImGui. And I'm pretending that it's a bot, but it's actually just me just going out and searching for ImGui and just telling people it's Dear ImGui, by the way. Um, but I'm very sorry for that. I think it's confusing. But in a way, I think we can talk about it later. I think even the acronym ImGui, I mean, it's been really useful that Kazi has kind of like put a name on this thing and try to formalize it some way. But I think the space of the amount of thing we can make is very kind of large, and I think the acronym has been sort of like uh, lessening the discussion about it, because people just tend to think in terms of like I'm GUI or I'm GUI, there's a different thing, and they just want to kind of make them just two kind of padding fight each other or whatever. I just think of them as two different things that are very distinct. Um, but I think it's just there's a dozen properties that are very different and very unique to each implementation. And it's not worth discussing in terms of one kind of acronym that would define all the properties. And I think it's possible to develop something that would have the qualities of DMGUI while being very different, very different API style, API style. So I don't think that discussing that paradigm is has been helping because people are just stay in a camp. I like this or I don't like this, and instead of discussing specific properties.
It's I think it's also maybe confusing to people who are not um, like it's not that many people who wandered the path of making their own UI library from scratch in C or C++, and like uh, got to know about immediate
Mhm.
mode GUI. Like normally, if you have a language like Java, like an language plus ecosystem, it ships or like there
Yeah,
is like a library. There's usually a
yeah.
retain mode, and you're like kind of oh, is this how you do it? Like you kind of don't think about it too much. And then if somebody is like trying to do their own thing, they come up with their own immediate mode library. Now it's like 15 different libraries. They are like kind of like all fighting for this like within the same sort of namespace.
The thing that is that when you have to make games, I mean, initially I wrote it to write debug tools for a game that was running on the Vita, right? If you write something that run on the console, you have to create your own UI system anyhow, anyway, right? Because uh, Qt or WPF they won't work on those consoles. So what people used to do a lot is that they used to have tools on the PC, and the tool was kind of like communicate with the console via network protocol or whatever, which is totally doable. Lots of people still do that, of course, but it's kind of a big constraint. It means you have to design things upfront a lot, whereas sort of the beauty of having something that runs natively on the console is that you can, especially IMGU style, is that you can just get started and display data wherever it is. You don't have to set up a protocol of where to send the data and using what format or whatever. You can just display it. Um, but I mean, it's natural for AAA game programmer. There's just, they write, eat random libraries for breakfast when they need them, right? Even if the beauty about IMGUAs in general is that writing a very simple one is very easy. If you read on my page is a list of link about kind of old article about the concept. And if you watch Kazi's video and read a few articles, you can probably write a very simple one with button sliders in an afternoon, right? Uh, which is kind of a trap because then you will keep improving it forever, right? Like every library that you make. But it's not that hard to start, right? Actually, what's difficult is to keep something going and not drop it and not break code. when something is existing, right? But you can probably make your own ImGui thing in an afternoon and you will enjoy it. Um, but if you want to make something that's used by, thousands of people and that lasts, the your problems are different problems than
Oh yeah.
if you make a one day thing, right?
So let's talk about these problems then. Like for dear ImGui, what is
Yeah.
like the spectrum of functions that people over time wanted to like expect from the library? Because obviously you started from like a simple library, and over time people kept asking for more, I presume. So if you could like go through like a large on the top level sort of features, what what were the things that you started with and then kept like adding because they were requested? I know it's like more than 10 years of development, so it's not an easy
Yeah,
ask.
I mean, I don't think there's one specific thing. Initially, I think it was a library that was useful to present data on the screen. So it's like you can think of it as an interactive printf. Like you have data, you just print it out, and then you add buttons and you add tree nodes, but it's always usually kind of traversing data that you have in your engine and you want to display it in a kind of fancy way that is interactive. So initially the basic stuff where, arranging data in a way that makes sense, and in ImGui, in dear ImGui implementation, it means having tree nodes, uh, windows with scrolling, and then displaying text. That's the very basic stuff. And then you add interaction. Interaction is just button, checkbox, sliders, radio button, very basic things. Uh, but I guess people kept on wanting to do more complex things over time. And I mean, there's nothing very surprising to it, but it just handles, a thousand little things. It's not like there's one big thing, right? It's like one day you want a text edit box and you want it to be multi-line. I mean, that was there from day one, but you want multi-line edit box, and then you want actually multi-line wasn't there for day one. A single line was there. Um, uh, People wanted, multi-selection. People wanted to display large list of items with tens of thousands or million of items. People wanted docking. It's most like death by a thousand cuts, thousand features. And actually, I think in my sort of blog post from last year, I kind of looked at I counted the number of function of flags. So there's a lot of flags in ImGui function, and I guess each flag is, in a way, it's a feature, right? It's like an opt-in feature. And I think I counted there was about, let me see, I'm looking at, there was about 500 function and 500 flags. So it's sort of hard to sort of like say there's one big feature um, that took a lot of time. It's more like, maintaining, growing toward this 1,000 small features and making sure they sort of make sense in the context of each other and are sort of like manageable for myself and understandable for other people. But particularly, lots of people are using it right now. I mean, not lots, but some people are using it as a replacement for Qt or WPF for like fancy toolkits. So they basically want everything, they want large selections, plotting, charting, node graphs, being able to select, 10,000 of items, all kind of things that you would expect from a toolkit eventually. We're sort of like very slowly heading toward those things. Um, but there's not one single feature. It's just more like, yeah, million small one.
Why did you say death by the thousand cuts? Because like it does look like death because DRI is like so popular at this moment and there are so many tools.
Yeah,
I can only imagine the number of tools that you don't know
yeah,
about in the AAA game companies that were built. They're still there because the engine didn't change and like the UI
yeah,
is still there. You have nobody, like you have no idea about them, but they're still running. So
yeah. There's this. thousands and thousands of tools, yeah, probably, that I never seen.
Now, let's get technical.
Yeah.
First, for the people who are listening, for the people who are listening to this podcast in general, they've already heard ImGui mentioned, like
Hmm?
immediate mode in general, but every now and then probably new people arrive here. So maybe we can quickly define in what would be for you immediate mode GUI versus retained mode GUI, and what would be the advantages of the first thing.
So I would say the sort of traditional UI, I've been using a retain kind of logic, where the idea is that you sort of like you declare the UI layout to your system. So you say, hey, they're going to be a tree node, they're going to be a button here. You kind of sort of declare the full thing. Um, and so the UI system knows about everything. The problem is that your whenever you want to change it, the complications start happening. Uh, the core idea of ImGui is that you have one single source of truth, and it's that source of truth aims to be your own copy of the data. And in an ImGui API, you sort of like take your data and you transform it, you submit it to the UI, but the UI system won't keep it for long or won't keep it at all. And so your copy of the data is always the kind of the true copy, because with retain mode UI, usually you have callbacks, you have to synchronize things, and if you want to be reflecting a data set that's your basically a game engine, where there's a thousand of entities and things being added every time, it's very difficult to know the diff of something, like the difference between last frame, for example, or the say you run a simulation, right? A particle simulator that creates particles and add particles, and for some reason you want to be editing all of them, that's a weird example, but let's say you want to do that. You've got this kind of low-level logic that creates particles, remove particles. You don't want this low-level logic to be updating the UI system and say, hey, this particle has been created now, please add a control for it, or please add it to a list. This particle has been removed, or this entity has been removed. You don't want this kind of low-level system that has to be optimized to care about the UI system. So, and that with retain UI system, synchronization is very difficult when you make change afterwards. With ImGui style, the idea is that you take your UI, you take your data and you sort of reflect it as UI. And you will kind of update that. On every update, you will just take your data again and reflect it as UI, meaning the UI always reflects your actual data, the current status of it. And if you kind of like entity or particle number has changed, it will be sort of correctly visualized in the UI. And so that's a long explanation to say what I call the one source of truth. I think Anton used the same terminology a few days ago when you made a podcast. I forgot when. Um, I would say that's one of the core property of ImGuis. Uh, uh, it's really hard to define what's a core property, but I think a common um, recurring property of many implementation has been to, let me look at my notes so I will say something useful. It's been really hard to do that. I mean, I have a page dedicated to try to define what exactly it means. Um, I think one way I would put it is it kind of promotes calling function, meaning you can easily compose things. Um, Whereas traditional system would retain data and then you have to mutate the data. If everything is gone through calling function, then you can more easily kind of like customize the function call order or compose things to create kind of new behavior, I guess. Because whenever something is expressed as data, it's sort of limiting the when everything is expressed as data, it has a very kind of like limited scope of what it can do. Code is more expressive. Code is like you change one line of code, you can just have very widely different behavior. And I think it's more powerful. So I think the UI layout is not expressed in data, it's expressed in code. And that make it widely more flexible, at least for us programmers. And I think people have a tendency where they want UI designers to design layout of things, um, which is fine if you want to make something look pretty and have a kind of like um, a full UI and UX pass over things. It makes sense. Um, but I think and when programmers take control of UI, things become very flexible, which come at the risk of making things little less consistent because you can do everything with functions. So you can just decide to make change, and then if people don't agree on things, you can have two places in the code base can have very different checkbox that behave differently if people have just coded their own thing, right? But I think it's much easier to compose things when you create things using code rather than data. Because traditional UI, basically you create code to create the data, and then the data is unpacked by the UI system in some way. Whereas here you can have one less layer of interaction, and you can express anything you want. I don't know if that make any sense.
It did.
But I would say don't duplicate data and promote using code rather than encoding UI logic as data, which is sort of the aim that all the web tech are trying to kind of encode UI stuff as data, but eventually there's a bunch of callbacks. So you have code anyway to react to things. And this is what things get hairy anyway. So I think I'd rather it be the full code rather than code plus, data.
Yeah. Yeah, the downside being that now you need a person who can understand and ideally write the code to do the UI, because people who are like non-technical.
But I think it could be seen as a downside, but I think it's just a necessity for things to work. It's like, AAA have been, for example, using blueprints type stuff because, like, level designer say they don't want to run programming, so they learn blueprints, and then in the end with blueprints, it's like node graph thing. They end up making like extremely complex things that are it's actually programming, except it's programming but written using something that's much awkward to debug and to diff and to kind of like understand afterwards. So it's like they're trying to avoid the wall of learning programming, but eventually, I think there's just something that are better done with programmings, right? I think it's the same thing with, for example, gameplay stuff. I think people want to think or believe that if you want to make a game that plays super nicely, the right way is to expose a billion sliders and let the designer tweak the sliders. But I think code is so much more powerful than exposing the sliders. Because when you expose value, you sort of actually lock down the logic. When you work with code, you can always change the code. You can rearrange something. When it's expressed as data, then so the logic is locked. It becomes frozen, and it's harder to evolve kind of like the gameplay logic. I think it's the same thing. I think it's a necessary evil, so to speak. Yes, ImGui is designed toward programmers, but I guess it's a trade-off,
Now, in your notes, you mentioned something on immediate mode. You say rely on temporal coherency, which I didn't really understand, because you have like in immediate mode we have one pass. You can rely on the temporal coherency. What do you mean by that?
So my library is one pass. ImGui is a one pass thing. It means that for every frame, you submit items. So you submit your ImGui button calls, and ImGui doesn't really know what's coming next, and it doesn't really remember what came before. So ImGui at least doesn't sort of record. If you have 10,000 buttons submitted, it doesn't record anything about those 10,000 buttons. it only records the output, which is a vertex buffer that will render those 10,000 buttons. But it doesn't remember there were 10,000 buttons, right? Some people assume they remember those things, and it would be totally possible to write an ImGui library that sort of like retain a full kind of a graph of everything that has been submitted. It would remember everything and sort of be able to apply different features. But JMQ doesn't remember many things. It remembers only the thing it needs. So, for example, if you're focusing one item with a keyboard focus, for example, it will record things for this one items. But this is kind of a fixed storage for like the currently focused item, right? Um, it doesn't have many kind of like variable size storage in ImGui. There's not many of them. And so the question was, I rely on temporal currency, meaning that for many things, I rely on the fact that, last frame is going to be similar to the next frame. So resizing it done this way. For example, if you auto resize a window, it means on frame n, it's sort of recording the size of what was submitted, and on frame n+1, it's using that size to size the window, for example. Because that's basically the only way I can sort of like have an understanding of the amount of content is to sort of remember the thing I need to remember from last frame, which is very limited. Here would be the bounding box, for example, and use that as a size thing. But it has drawbacks because if you keep auto resizing and the content keep changing, then you will have one frame lagging in terms of resizing, right? Whereas if somebody implements a multipass ImGui thing, it would be an hypothetical multipass ImGui thing would be maybe for every window you have to loop, you have to. So the Unity system, for example, is multipass, right? And it runs your code, it calls your code multiple times, and the first time it will, for example, record all the items and their, for example, the size they want. It records everything. It does a layered pass because it has all the data it needs, and then it calls your code again, and then your code again. The next time it calls the same code, it will sort of like pull the size and position of those items or whatever was needed, and then apply them. And so multipass it's slower, of course, because by definition you're kind of running your kind of UI code multiple times. And if you have to recurse through things, it could be, it could be the complexity of recursing with multipass can go quadratic very easily. Depends how you do it. But then it has the advantage that the UI, it's easy for the UI to retain everything. But then if in different passes your code has side effects, then the two passes won't match. And then it can create. So for example, so ImGui, the Unity ImGui calls your function multiple times. I haven't used it actually, but it calls your function multiple times. If you code the first time, which is only supposed to submit item, I guess in the first pass, it isn't never supposed to be a side effect. As in, for example, the button function will never return true. It will always return false. But if for some reason your code changes data even if return false, or if you change your kind of like your one source of truth, then the next pass you will submit different items. The two pass won't match, and it will sort of create, I guess, hard to debug bugs or whatever. So I'm doing a single pass, and for a lot of things, I have to rely on the fact that things from frame one will look similar to frame two. Which is, I guess, similar to, when you do temporal anti-aliasing thing, and it has drawbacks because when things don't match, you can get those little glitches where, things resize or just glitchy for one frame because the size don't match, or on a case-by-case basis. Some item can appear or disappear one frame too late for whatever reason. There's kind of little glitches I'm sort of trying to hide behind the bushes, or find nice API trick to hide. But single pass is so much easier, uh, because it's faster and there's no sort of risk of side effect causing major troubles.
So I'm assuming this is like one of the architectural decisions that you have for DRM GUI to have single
Yes.
pass and to remain on single pass, despite
Yeah.
the number and the complexity of the features that come in with the requests.
I mean, I think there will be value in adding a multipass system in JRMQ at some point. Um, because I've noticed that usually when you have lots of items, so for example, if you have, I don't know, 10,000 of items submitted, that's a list or tree. In this case, usually you don't need fancy layouts. You only need like a list is like evenly sized items will be placed next to each other. So I think for large list of items, you actually don't need multipass. You need multipass when you have some very basic thing when you want to measure what's at the bottom of the window. If you have an OK button, for example, at the bottom of the window and a cancel button, and above it there's a scrolling region. That's not it's not difficult, but it's annoying to use in JMG because you have to typically create the typically you would create the scrolling region first, and you have to know how large the button bar is going to be. Uh, I think for this situation, it would make sense to have a multi-pass system in ImGui. Um, it's just that the library is rather complex, and it's likely won't be as easy to retrofit this. But I can imagine a system where you have a kind of like begin layout system that would rely on multipass rather than temporal currency. And that might be I'm not against doing it. And the reason I mentioned this large list without this example of the button is that most of the time, notice you need kind of like layouts for a finite number of items. You need kind of like layout function that are non-trivial, that needs to know about, that need to retain everything. You, you need them for a finite number of items. And when you have a very long or infinite number of items, you can just lay that down. You can just lay down in grid or in a list, and then you don't need multipass for that. So I guess my intuition is that if I add multipass system, it will be kind of opt-in and local. It will be like in the context of this window for this scope, this is multipass. But then when I go and recurse into my child's items, this is not multipass anymore, for example. And I guess the API would be designed so you have local multipass without having to recurse multipass. Um, so, it's a possibility it could come at some point. It's just that it's just part of my 1,000 list of things to do.
Yeah. Now, on one hand, we have immediate mode API of the library,
Yeah,
which is, for example, you can call a function to make a button. If the button was clicked, the if statement will be true, and then you can execute some code.
yeah,
And this is how the Dear ImGui works looks like on the calling side. Now,
yeah,
regarding the other side, the internals,
yeah.
how it is made, like what are the building blocks of the Dear ImGui, and how does it look like from the inside?
It's very dumb because it's trying to remember as less thing as possible. So it's kind of rasterizing things, placing them as you go. It's like as you submit a button. So ImGui, the API remembers kind of you have a cursor basically, which is the current spot you're laying out things. And when you submit a button, it will just calculate what the button size is according to its label or whatever parameters you pass to it, and then it will sort of do the mouse bounding box query, and it will do kind of all the logic on the spot as you call the button function. Um, So it's in a way, ImGui is sort of like really close in design to the kind of like proto ImGui library that you would write on day one. It's sort of the natural extension of that. It's not a lot fancier. It's like current position. I will lay out a square. I will test if the mouse is in that square or in that rectangle. And if it's in that, I will process the mouse button for this and kind of like perform the button interaction. That's sort of the general gist of it is that it's not smarter than that. Uh, it's smarter in the sense that it's doing a lot of things, and actually, of course, there's much more complexity to that. But it's not smarter in the sense that it's very straightforward. And if you debug step into the thing, you will see that it takes the current position and display something, and then display a little rectangle and the text inside it for a button at least, right? Um, But then if I have to go to the building blocks, I guess the lower level building block for ImGui is the what I call the draw list API, which is uh, it's its own mini library, I guess, where you can just draw text and shapes of all kind, right? And you can say, I want to draw a filled circle, I want to draw a line, I want to draw a text bit. Um, so this takes this command, which are function call currently, and it outputs a vertex buffer. And the way it does it basically it's trying to minimize the number of draw calls. So it's not using the graphics API system to draw, for example, lines. Or it's when it tries to draw a shape or a line, for example, it's using the same shader and the same logic as text elements. The way it does it is that everything we draw using ImGui is using one texture, which contain both text clips that have been rasterized into the texture as needed. And it contains basically a white pixel with a little gradient, and this white pixel is used as the UV coordinate for most shapes. So when you draw, for example, a triangle, right, all the inside area of the triangle, we use the same UV coordinate, which is the UV coordinate of that one kind of like white pixel in the texture. And then when you draw a text element, the UV coordinate will point to the four different locations that actually draw this quad. And then anti-aliasing for shapes is done using by drawing little fringe around shape. So if I want to draw a triangle, let's say a triangle, I have actual one triangle that uses this kind of white pixel, and then on the edge of this triangle, there's little fringes, which are, I guess, three little quads that will be 1 pixel thick and have UV coordinate that on one side point to a white pixel and one side point to white transparent pixel. So it's basically drawing a little gradient that's 1 pixel wide, and that sort of create the anti-aliasing thing. But the idea behind that is that it's the same shader that draws both text and shapes, so that you can overlay text and shapes in any kind of like any number of layer. You don't have to switch shader or switch draw calls, which means most content in a window can be drawn using one draw call. The exception, the varying parameter of that is the clipping rectangle, which is the scissoring rectangle,
Yeah.
which is the equivalent of GL scissors in OpenGL, which is a parameter to take the vertex shader to kind of stop rendering things when they're outside a certain rectangle. So I use that a lot, and I use it's done using the clipping rectangle, and that's a parameter that changes. So when you have, for example, a scrolling window, when you scroll text, I do my own sort of like clipping, where, for example, if a glyph doesn't appear in the view of the window, it won't be rendered, obviously. But if it overlaps the edge of the window, you will rely on the clipping rectangle to sort of like clip it out in the vertex shader. And so that clipping rectangle changes sometimes, and that creates draw calls. But it doesn't. Actually, it's not true what I said because sometimes I clip on the CPU, sometimes I clip on the GPU. There's different cases. But anyway, ImDrawList is basically this little mini library where you can send shapes to it, shapes and text, and it will just give you this vertex buffer. And that's sort of the lower level foundation of the ImGui. And the output of the draw list is basically what ImGui rendering backends have to render. They're given a list of vertex buffer, an index buffer, and draw calls, and they just render that shit out. Um, and then over that is the UI system, which is ImGui, which is sitting on top of draw list. And ImGui is basically uh, a bunch of ad hoc crap that handle high-level concepts such as Windows, and then it's many little helpers that allows to create little widgets. And then the widgets, buttons, sliders, they all technically they could be a different library. Technically, I guess I could ship core MGU with just lower level function that do the kind of layout and that little helpers that say, hey, let's draw a frame, let's query if the mouse is inside this rectangle, um, let's kind of like score an item for navigation to tell which one is the most uh, the best candidate for moving the arrow left or right, for example. There's a bunch of kind of core helpers and then the widget sitting above it. I guess that would be the three kind of like layers, if any. Uh, but it's a little porous because between core ImGui and the actual widgets, I mean, I guess there's two layers. I guess there's core ImGui and the widgets, which could be separated technically, but they haven't been separated. Um, my biggest surprise is that nobody has tried to, or maybe I don't know. Actually, a few people have done it, but it's possible to just ignore my own widgets like ImGui sliders, for example, or ImGui whatever table, and just write your own using all the lower level components that are in ImGui, which is kind of the focusing system, the scrolling stuff, the windowing stuff. You could sort of use that and then create your own widgets that would look very widely different. And then you would be kind of like free of the constraint that my own sort of like sliders have or, checkboxes.
And
Um,
also you would kind of have your own API a little bit, right? Like you would present the API in your way, this if you were to do it.
oh yeah, I guess you just create a new namespace and call it my GUI button. I mean, technically you could copy and paste my button code and just do changes to it, right? I think most people who have been trying to do kind of like hardcore styling of the library has been doing that basically. They've been modifying my widgets directly or copying them and modifying them. And then you can, because right now the way it's architectured is that it's not easy to dissociate the logic from the rendering. So the button code is sort of calling a helper that does the button logic. That seems simple, but has a lot of subtleties. And then it does the drawing, and the drawing is sort of hard coded to, hey, let's draw a frame and a border and text inside it, and maybe center text or whatever. That's the logic for a button. And if the mouse is over the button, you will pick this color for the button, for the filling of the button. If the mouse is clicked, you will pick this color. If the mouse is outside it, you pick a third color. That sort of logic, which is only a few lines, but it's sort of hard-coded inside the button code. So if you want to, say, animate that, say, um, I want, when you hover over the button, instead of changing color immediately, it's going to use start a timer and animate the color. That's literally 2 lines of code change, but you have to change them inside my widget code right now, right? Which is sort of a limitation of the system. Um, but it makes code it makes the code much simpler this way, right?
In the 10 years of dear ImGui, you didn't get the feature request to say let's animate the buttons. I guess so. Like, I don't think it's like a such a hot necessity for most people.
Animation, not so few, but I mean, it's been in the necessity for many people to make the library look much better because it doesn't look good right now by default. Um, and I guess what I explained in many places is that, I mean, 10 years ago, I was saying, oh, maybe in 2 years it will look great. And it still doesn't look great today. I mean, it looks better, uh, but it doesn't look great by default. I guess if you tweak it a little bit, you can make it look okay, as in bearable, not great, and that maybe bearable is enough. Um, there's many reasons for that, but the primary reason is that GMQ has too many users right now and too many features requests that I'd rather throttle down the number of users, using the library. And one way to throttle down the number of users is to keep a little kind of like an adoption wall and keeping it fugly and not well documented is a way to limit the number of users, which gives me time to improve the core features. And I think at some point where I will be happy about the core features, then maybe I can spend a few months and say, okay, let's make this library look great, right? But also, so that's one reason I'm trying to not have too many users until I'm ready, that is, because I think there's a lot of code that I want to write and I've been planning. It's a giant puzzle, right? It's a giant puzzle because if when your code is used by people, it becomes harder to change it. So I'm making change little by little in layers over the years, but there's many lower level things that I've been meaning to change for 10 years I haven't done yet, and maybe I will change them this year or next year, whatever, but it takes time. Uh, and I think when everything is in place, I will I will be happier to make it look better by default, right? But it's been slowly improving. The look has been subtly, slowly improving over the years. Um, but it also because the more you work on something and you look at something, the more complex you know what the good solution is. So it's like people come and say, I want this button to look nicer, and they have one idea that comes up. But to me, the writer solution that will last 10 more years is more complex than the solution they propose. So I'm sort of like, because I don't want to break the library too often, too many times, the day I change the styling system, well, maybe the change will break a lot of code, but I want the change to happen at once. So it has to be sort of correct. And to be correct, I have to accumulate enough knowledge and enough requests. I understand exactly what needs to be done for kind of a V2 of the styling system. Um, so that's the second reason, basically. I'm accumulating data so that I will be able to make a change that will break things once instead of breaking things every 2 months or every 2 years, right? Um, and then I think there was a third reason about the look and feel, but I forgot what it is. Yeah, it's also because making UI look a little bit fugly, with little things that are not aligned and don't look pretty, makes you very powerful because it becomes very fast to add things. If everything, for example, if you create a tool and everything has colorful icons, then when you want to add a feature, you say, okay, I'm missing a color icon. Somebody needs to draw it, right? It becomes a hurdle to add things. So part of the power of ImGui, of dear ImGui, has been that by letting go of the fact that things have to look very pretty, it empowers programmers to just make shit happens. And I think, if everything looks fancy, usually it creates a little more friction to create things. So my ultimate goal, if I design a styling system to make it look good, it will still be constrained by the fact that I want people to be able to create UI fast, right? because if you expose too many options, if you know, if for every button you expose like 15 parameters to for the look of the button, then of course the UI is going to become complex to use, right? And styling is complex. You know, CSS on the web is a mess. It's very powerful, but it's very complex. I will have to come up with a system that make it look great enough, but doesn't add too much complexity to UI creation, and that's complex by itself. Um, so every people keep asking about suggestion to add visual things here and there, and sometimes I just cave in. But overly, the bigger styling stuff hasn't changed a lot in 10 years yet, and it will change at some point. But I'm just deferring things and making people wait. Um, but it will happen at some point. Maybe it's the last thing I do. Well, maybe if I decide to give up ImGui, right? I will spend 6 months and make it look very pretty and then disappear. I don't know. But eventually it will look better, and I think it's been looking better. But and actually, the reason I cave in to the frick to the I cave in and I make it look slightly prettier all the time is that I don't want to lose too many people. I mean, I don't want to attract too many people, but I don't want people to say, okay, this thing looks too bad and we can't sort of like um, we have to find another solution. I need to sort of keep them on board and give them just enough kind of like improvement over time so that they don't leave and while they wait for the big change to happen. And the big change might happen at some point. I hope GM during 3 years will look super nice, but no. But that was, I mean, you ask about animation. People don't ask so much about animation, but they ask about general visual design. And I've noticed something that in many studios, um, there's many studios where programmers have kind of identified that JMGUI was probably a good solution to the problem, but there's usually the way to kind of prove people that it's a viable solution is to make the tool look nice, right? Because the programmer have noticed that, hey, we can make this tool 10 times faster with JMGUI rather than Qt, for example. But then management or the designer or the artist will tell them, yes, but your tool looks very shit. So usually to sort of convince upper management that JMGUI is a viable solution, they sort of like put a little more focus on visual look, which is fair, you know. And this also for those people that over time made it easy to improve the look, you know, just that it's bearable enough, but not great looking. And also, yes, a cost, you know. People think, you know, uh, if you start adding shadow and random stuff everywhere, you know, these things are not free. You have to sort of like create the code, maintain the code, and things have to run on the CPU, on the GPU, and like for example, artists tends to visual artists, they like to just overlay a lot of things, and but they don't know that if you want to do that dynamically, you know, on a GPU, on a CPU, there's a cost to it, right? It's not nothing is free, so I have to balance that out in the
Just
system also.
sprinkle in 7 layers of transparency to the widgets.
Yeah, I mean, my last game, I made a game called Wonder Boy: The Dragon's Trap, and the artist was that when you want to create like blur effect or whatever, he would create this little cloud thing, and he would put the transparency as like I don't know 2%, and it would just like add like fucking shitload in the scenery, and the result was a white thing almost, but there would be like 100 layer of overdraw. And it works because it's a 2D game and it's running on an NVIDIA card or whatever. But then when you want to run the same game on an integrated card, it doesn't run anymore. So you have to go and optimize the data or just find, way to render the transparency layer differently. Um,
So I want to talk to you about the API design of Dear ImGui because like this is a
yeah,
library. It's used for more than 10 years now, and it's a
yeah,
testament. Like everybody would tell you that like Dear ImGui is great, mainly because you can like make stuff happen in seconds. You just get this stuff down and
yeah,
then you do it. And a lot of it is in great API design that you've made initially and then kept not
yeah,
ballooning over 10 years. So what are your
yeah.
what are your like principles for API design, and what do you do to keep it simple?
Uh, I guess you want the simple things to be simple, right? And you want to. I didn't think about it ahead of time, right? I borrowed this idea from ImGui that at QGame that Atman wrote, which at the very dumb API, the button call was button label and return bool, uh, and that's very convenient, right? I get what makes sense is that to work toward having good default. So I'm not trying to make things, I mean, I'm trying to make things generic, but when I want to develop a features, I'm trying to think in terms of actual real world scenarios that how can people use tables, right? Uh, and I tend to create widgets that are kind of slightly high level and opinionated, like uh, for example, the API for tables, you can have a sorting tables, uh, and you can mark columns are sortable, and sortable means there's a little sorting arrow in the corner of the header. You can click on it. It's very pragmatically aligned with actual expected use of UI. And I think lots of programmers, when they want to design a UI toolkit, they will go and try to abstract all those things to kind of lower level chunks to say, hey, everything can be configurable, and I want to move these things here and these things here. And then suddenly this kind of neat little abstraction that is one button becomes a bunch of smaller things. And the smaller things are harder to implement, more complex to implement, more complex to maintain, and maybe have more complex API. So my API, I basically try to work toward common sense. What's the most common thing that's going to happen? And it's very high level in a sense. It high level concept of this is a pop-up window, and a pop-up window has slightly different properties than normal windows. Um, but over time, what happens is that all those kind of high-level abstraction that I wrote initially, people tend to dismantle them because in the end, we want a finer. As we drill down, we want the finer kind of like level of the finer chunks to be available. But I really hard. I start from the kind of like the slightly high level abstraction than I think some programmer would do. And it's good defaults is important. It means that basically there's a very large number of parameters for everything, right? If you have a button, do you want the button to be the label to be center, or if it's a wider button, or the label to be left aligned, or the button to look like this or that. Um, the good API is about choosing what those parameters are, at least in ImGui. It means that, for example, some parameters are function parameters because they would have a tendency to be tweaked on a per instance basis. So you have two different buttons, and maybe this one button, for whatever reasons, needs to be triggered on mouse down instead of mouse up, for example, or needs to be repeating things. Maybe there will be a function parameter to the button, right? But the look and feel of the button, which I call the style in ImGui, technically is a parameter of the button, except I store it in a sort of global stack that's separate from the button, because that's something that will change with a much lower frequency than the like the button label you change it every time. The button colors and rounding or border style, you don't want to change it with the same frequency. So it's sort of like it ends up being in different places. And so the awkwardness of ImGui, it has parameters in many places. It has parameters that are explicit in the function call. It has parameters that are part of kind of a global setting, like the ImGui style thing. It has parameters that are part of different stacks, and it has uh, I have all those little functions that called set next item, for example, things, or set next window things, which in a way is an extra way to pass parameters to a window, right? So windows have many parameters, but the frequent one you want to change are the basically the window title and its flags. Uh, but there's many parameters that are passed through other function calls. So when you use this function call, the code becomes a little more kind of like less compact. There's more calls to do, but it is sort of rarer kind of occurrences and things that you change a little less. And because it's all function calls, you can always wrap this in a different function. So if there's something that takes 3 lines to do that's annoying, because it's just a function, you can just wrap that and make it single line function that will do the 3 things. Um, but I think so. Good defaults are important both for ease of use of the code, because sort of you want the code to be as simple as possible, as compact as possible somehow. I mean, this is a one metric that I value. Maybe some people don't value it as much. Um, uh, the other metrics is um, the other parameter is how things evolve over time. So, for example, if I had a feature add tab bar, for example,
I think what you've said so far is already like
yeah,
blowing my mind in the idea that like,
okay,
hey,
yeah,
you have a
yeah,
button and the button obviously has a label and has a theme. But the
yeah,
frequency of changing a theme for a given button and a label, they're like way
yeah,
off. So if you have a
yes,
simpler design, if you want to have a simpler API, you can split
yeah,
them apart. And now you don't need to
yes,
have like theme every now and then, like in the function and like
yes. And if you think about it, this is what CSS is doing in some way, right? Uh, it's sort of like
create a class.
trying to dig, yeah. Uh, but I think some programmer will have a tendency to sort of like not accept limitation of the system and try to do something that's overly generic where everything can be changed at everywhere, and it sort of tends to make more complex APIs. Um, Another layer of things about design API is that I always try to look forward to what's coming next. So when I add a new feature, I mean naming, for example, naming thing, naming flags, naming function or concept is very important things, especially in ImGui because things have been lasting for 10 years, right? Hopefully they will last for 10 more years. It's very important then that I don't rename concept all the time. Lots of the time when I'm adding feature A, right? I need to sort of like to name the flag for feature A. I'm sort of looking forward, and I need to design and even kind of like do a proof of concept for feature B and C and D and whatever, because I want to make sure that the API for A and the name for A will sort of work out when I add the future thing. So I always sort of like envision what's coming next, even if I don't have a full implementation of it. I always kind of like try to think ahead in terms of features. It means that basically, practically, I have like 200 or 300 branches with sort of experiments and notes. They're very kind of small feature branches, right? They're like, okay, I want to toy with this concept. I'm gonna make a proof of concept just to sort of understand what it means. And if I'm gonna have to implement this thing for real in 2 years, I want to sort of have a kind of understanding how I will have to interface this thing. And having this proof of a concept helps me design the API for the feature that's already in the API. Because if I don't do that, I release feature A, and when I release feature A next year, I realize that the name for A was ambiguous, for example. Because feature A makes the name for A ambiguous, so I need to change the name for something, or it's just harder to pick names. And if I want to pick name that last, I need to do this sort of work for things, right? Also, it's not when I say I have 200 branches, it's not, you know, making a proof of concept for something is usually quite easy. It's usually the amount of the details to finish some things make up the sum of the work, but just the sometimes the proof of concept is just like, even just typing out the name of the features as an enum, how you would name these flags, you know, and then you look at things and you say how it's gonna, you look at all the flags for the potential features that don't exist yet, and you can see that there's patterns that, oh, this will be arranged, this can be, those things can be bundled in this concept, and this is going to be probably different parameters. So maybe it makes sense that this thing is already different parameters because it will kind of like make more sense when I evolved it. Um, so it's basically, forward thinking or forward planning in some way. Uh, yeah, that's I guess what that's one of the key, and I've been doing it a lot, even more than I've been doing. I haven't not been doing that when I started ImGui, obviously, because the thing is that when you're the sole users or when your code base is private, you work on a game, you're one company, 50 people, whatever. It's very easy to rename things.
Oh yeah.
You make a mistake, it's fine. You can just change things, shuffle. You can reorder parameters. There are tools for that. Um, if your engine start being used by the three games in the same company, it gets a little harder because usually people would fork the engine version, and then sometimes you don't want to create excessive change that you have to wait changes. Like, okay, this change is kind of like cosmetic. It's nice, but it will create a pain when people have to merge in 2 years. Sometimes you don't make the changes, right? So, and the more user you have, the more kind of like you have to be considerate of changes. So it's the good API design for me is also a way to kind of minimize risk for future users. And the more users I have and the more kind of feedback I have from users, the more I get kind of like paranoid with if I'm going to add this one feature, it needs to be right. Because if it's not right, people are going to copy the code and use it in 1,000 projects. And it's going to be very hard for me to change it. And this is also why I have 200 branches, is that I have a lot of things that are kind of like 50% done. And if it were 10 years ago, I would have released the feature already. But now, because I have many followers and many people adopting the features, I want to sort of hide them away until I know that they're going to be safe and they're not going to put people in trouble or me in trouble, because they're going to use things in a way they're going to break, right? So I need enough confidence that it's going to last. And I'm still paying the cost of, design mistakes I made like 11, 12 years ago. I'm still paying the cost of this thing. And I guess when I add new features, I want to I want to minimize those kind of mistakes I made, right? So I'm much slower, right?
How
Uh,
do you get this confidence then that the feature is like well designed? You spent some number of hours working on it on a
I
branch
spent.
201, and then what happens?
It's not that there's not. It's not like there's a IMG 2.0 branch. It's just there's a lot of small branch for like a lot of small features, right? Um, I've seen, I've worked in UI and tools for a long time, and I keep talking to lots of people, so I sort of know what people are expecting and wanting, and I've got lots of documents of what people want. So I guess I build confidence by just exploring every possible path for given features, right? So if I need to add, I don't know, I mean, today, if I were to add the sliders to ImGui, a new slider, I would probably like procrastinate for 1 month over it, right? Whereas 10 years ago, I would just add the first thing I did, which had mistakes, but I would sort of like explore all possible way to make sliders to kind of like find the best things. Um, so my progress is slower today, but it has bigger reach, so it's worthwhile. Um,
So let's
let
maybe shift to the sort of, because it aligns with your long-term view. I wanted to discuss this. How do you like
Yeah,
approach Dear ImGui development in terms of like you mentioned a couple of times already that you wanted to last 10 years more on top of the 12 years that it already
yeah.
lasted. So how does it change apart from you taking more care about thinking about the design and but what do you think like matters in this long-term view thinking? Is there some sort of strategy that you developed for it?
Um, I would say right now my sort of business biggest asset is kind of like confidence and trust. Like people have, in games engine especially, sometimes game engine in AAA still uses a lot of custom game engine that last for years and years. They have code that lasts for years and years. And the fact that they can update ImGui and still syncs the ImGui and still sync works, uh, give them faith that it's going to keep working, right? And this is quite unusual, especially in open source, because the tendency with open source and with programmers in general is that they write V1 or one thing, version one of one thing, and then maybe it gets successful or it gets used. And after 1 year, they notice so many issues with version one that they just want to delete it and write version two, right? This is sort of the exciting and tempting things to do, right? To sort of like start from a blank slate. Um, and of course, it's valuable. This is how you innovate, but you keep doing that, you lose people, like, and they sort of like lose trust in the long-term viability of your technology. And I think the value of ImGui, dear ImGui, sorry, is that, however, yeah, see, even I say ImGui. Uh, the value of dear ImGui is that even though clunky it is, and he has API mistakes and inconsistency and bugs here and there and things that are not perfect, but it's been lasting long enough that uh, I guess people are building a lasting belief that it's going to last more, right? Because they've seen me running around and kind of like withholding the sort of the long-term pressure of keeping that thing kind of like alive and useful. And if you think about it, if you look at uh, lower level kind of OS API, right? Later, the worst API is the Win32 API, which is kind of the lowest level Windows API that has been basically designed for, I think, Windows 3.1 or whatever, Windows 3.0. It's a very old API with the kind of message pump and stuff. And some of the defined have been here for 30 years or whatever. I don't know. It's a terrible API, but it's actually the best one that people are using today to build most things because it's been reliable. And every 5 years or 10 years, Microsoft comes and say, we're going to clean that up and make a new thing. But due to the technical choice they make and due to their policy, it just happened you can't trust the new things because we learned that the new thing either it has like just dubious technical choices and they're making use kind of weird technology. Either you kind of realize that they're going to drop it after 5 years or whatever. So actually, the only reliable tech on Windows is the Win32 API, right? So I guess the ImGui is sort of in that state where it has a lot of legacy, uh, but people have sort of understood that they can build something on and it's going to last. And for someone to come in and compete, they have to make something that's nicer, and that's pretty easy to do, to be honest. But they have to make something that's nicer and that lasts, and that people will kind of, because if the person makes something very nice and sort of like fail to maintain it or to monetize it or just get bored about it after 2 years and the things get unmaintained, then the technology is fucked, right? So I guess people have appreciated that I've been sort of like carrying this this piece of code, and code, is a liability, and it's annoying to maintain, and it's terrible, but I think it has value by being sort of like reliable over time. And I think that's my biggest asset. And I think some of my biggest sponsors, which are very big, AAA companies sponsoring me, I think they value that. I remember I got one time I met, I can't name them for reasons, but they basically the lead developer of a very famous game. And at some point, I think I mentioned GMGui 2.0, and they were sort of triggered, and they wanted to ask me what GMGui 2.0 meant, right?
They were concerned.
And they were concerned, basically. They were concerned that I would just decide to break things. And I told them that GMGui 2.0 would be like, okay, I'm gonna take the freedom to break a few more things, but it's gonna be overall the same thing, right? Rather than I'm gonna delete all the code and make a new system. And I think it was very happy to hear that from me. And the reason is that they probably have, 100,000 of lines using GMGui. And I talk to companies telling me, hey, we have 100 programmers using GMGui every day. And of course, we want the code to kind of not break too much.
And then you ask them, so what was the sponsorship like you've done if so much of the stuff you make rely on the software that I made? And it's like, oh, we actually forgot to sponsor.
No, but actually, I mean, it's happening. I mean, over time, people have been realizing that this thing has been reliable, and they understand that the best way they can keep it reliable is to kind of pay me, so I can work on it, or so I can eventually hire people to work on it. So I'm not gonna kind of drop it, right? And
does it improve
and I guess
over time? When you have like a library, like 12 years ago, ImGui started.
yeah,
So does it like improve over time in terms of like the number of people wanting to sponsor the work?
it has improved over time. Yeah, it's improved a lot. But I mean, I've been putting a lot of energy doing that. Thinking, founding, and it's not like people just knock at your door and
Yeah.
say we want to give you money. Sometimes it happens, but usually, I have to ask people. I kind of like stalk people. I organize meetings. I sort of like over over time, I sort of improved my way of talking to people to convince them that it would be worthwhile to kind of sponsor me. And so it's been improving over time, and I'm very happy. What I've noticed is this pattern of people who have been, maybe they started a company like, maybe 7 years ago, and they used ImGui for little things, and maybe they sponsored me for a little amount because it was a very small company, and then 5, 10 years later, they became successful, and those people were there at the beginning and they sort of remember and they realize that they've been sort of like owing to ImGui in some way, and then sort of they're happy to pay a little more for it, after sometimes. But of course, that's still, I don't want to say, I mean, it's still a minor fraction of people using it, right? But from my point of view, it just needs to be enough that I can keep working on it without having to double think, maybe I should get a better paying job somewhere else, right?
Yeah.
Uh,
This to me,
uh,
like, this reality is okay. How do you keep motivation in this type of like world where you know that you're a skilled engineer? You could just go there, apply, like stop doing that, and have like per hour your financial income like grow by 10 times.
uh, well, no, there's two, not by ten. Okay, there's two aspects of it. The first aspect is that eventually I've been making good money nowadays. Like, it's not like I've been making good money now. That's competitive money, um, which allows me to not have to think about this,
Okay.
right? And I think this is what people are paying me for. They're paying me for so I don't have to think about it. If I made average or bad money, I would be constantly thinking, oh, I should be doing something else. Now I'm making good enough money that I don't have to think about it all the time. The problem being that I have to keep chasing that money because it's not like it's as recurrent as people are willing to make it recurrent. And I have to lots of companies they help me one year and then whatever, the next year or they disappear or they don't, you know, want to found again because they have other things to do when, the economics are tricky for everyone. So I have to keep chasing founding, but otherwise I'm making well enough that I keep pushing that, right? The only problem, it takes time to do this chasing money,
Oh
right?
yeah,
And this is time that I'm not programming,
and
right?
energy.
When I just, yeah, it takes time and energy. And sometimes it's discouraging because you can see that um, some people clearly they could. There's some very big project that made lots of money using ImGui, and clearly they could sort of like sponsor you. So sometimes it's a bit discouraging, but there's also a lot of encouraging things happening,
Okay.
right? And so uh, that's the first kind of answer to your question. The second answer is that just I guess it's pride in just making something that's useful, right? And I know it's useful, and I'm happy to, I'm lucky to be able to make something that I know is useful to many people, right? And I even get many messages, people thanking me, or I could make this or this project happen. So I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud that I can keep it open source and free software. Um, and I sort of want it to fulfill kind of its kind of full potential. As in, there's many things I want to do with it that are not done, right? And I feel like if I dropped it today, I would sort of feel ashamed that, oh, I haven't finished doing this thing. Those 200 branches, I haven't finished them. So I would feel like, I guess I'm a completionist. I want to sort of like push things to their kind of, uh, whatever, pinnacle or something. So I like to kind of like, I don't like giving up with this. But I think there will be a natural plateau at this point, at some point. I don't know when, but I think that there's probably a point where the return on investment, it will be just too hard to change, to make, you know, big changes to it, and we'll feel stuck, and maybe we'll give up. I don't know exactly when it would happen, 5 years, in 10 years, I don't know. Um, Maybe there will be a point where I get bored. I guess I will get bored when um, if the rate of improvement gets too slow and it's too hard to improve things, and maybe there's many competing technology that are kind of like um, good enough that they are kind of worthwhile competitor to JMGUI. Uh, Maybe there will be a point where I say, okay, it's not worth pursuing that. Maybe that other technology is better, right? And actually, my dream is that somebody shows up and makes something that's clearly better for MGA purposes, because it kind of frees me from doing that. But until that happens, I feel like I'm sort of like stuck doing this thing because I feel it's useful, right? Um, but I think this end, I imagine what will naturally happen because lots of people have been trying to make UI system, and there's new one happenings because there's still a gap in UI. JMGUI, because it's not designed to make fancy looking desktop app. People want to solve that problem themselves, and they try to make new toolkits. I think at some point there will be probably a toolkit that will sort of like very clearly replace Qt and be kind of like for desktop app thing. There's one called PanGui, for example, that's in kind of like early development. That looks kind of like fancy enough that it might kind of like be, a successful thing. The problem is that all those toolkits will be targeting basically desktop app, but JMGUI is targeting both kind of desktop app, but also kind of like ad hoc real-time game engine on console apps, which is sort of different type of use case, right? Desktop app would be kind of very static looking, polished, well designed, well integrated UI stuff, whereas the other target of ImGui is like, we need to make tools for this game engine.
ASAP.
We have 20 pro we need yeah, we have 20 programmers do 20 programmers are engine programmers. They don't care about UI. They want something that are fast and portable. And the people are not going to use something that's like Qt or WPF that's too complex for them. So what I imagine is that at some point a toolkit will take a clear lead over ImGui and Qt for desktop app, but it's going to be harder for competitor to come on the sort of like a hacky, kind of quick UI thing that just works everywhere, right? Because ImGui works on a microwave or whatever, it works, and like people have ported to the Sega Dreamcast, or
Really?
this kind of like, yeah, or I mean, it runs. I think it probably takes half of the RAM and half of the CPU, but it's like it can work everywhere, right? Um, this kind of like for this kind of use case, uh, it would take lots of energy for someone to replace it, but it's totally possible, right? The problem is that if somebody wants to replace the ImGui, they have to write something that's better. Which, to be honest, I don't think it's very hard. If you're programmer that knows the ins and outs of it and spend a year, they can probably do something, or 6 months, they can do something fancier. But they have to do something better and fancier that works for other people, and then they have to find a way to monetize it. And there's two other tasks that are kind of like enormous tasks by themselves. If you look at, for example, the rat debugger thing, right? As a really cool looking UI system, right? Which is a kind of its own custom library. It looks great. It's probably fancier in some way than ImGui, right? But it's been written in a very opinionated way for this use case, right? If you start opening this and having more users, the more users you have, they will ask for different things. They will sort of like make that development heavier, right? And maybe it will happen at some point. It's great, right? But the more user you have, the bigger weight you're carrying, right?
Of course.
And then you have to found it. So considering that ImGui is free, if you want something to compete against it, you have to make something that somehow manage to attract either sponsors, either be great enough that it kind of attract sales, right? And I think that will happen naturally for desktop UI because there's a big market here, and some people will come up with something that works and take a big lead there, but I don't know which one yet. That doesn't answer the question. The question was, how do I keep motivated? Oh yeah, I keep motivated because it's useful, right? This is why I derailed, right? Because I was saying it is useful, and I was saying my wish that somebody take over the ImGui, and then I just started talking about what would be the difficulty. But it will naturally happen at some point, right? And at some point, my rate of progress will be maybe slower, and some other emerging competitor will happen, and maybe at that point I just give up. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I have no idea what will happen. But I'm sort of opinionated enough that I want to keep pushing it for a few more years.
You mentioned that there are like these things that you would like to ship, like you mentioned 200 branches. We talked about the styling. Is there something like big that's like keep gnawing at your head, and like because of like either backwards compatibility or like other reasons you didn't have enough time and opportunity to just like ship?
The styling, you mean, or
I mean,
the
what
thing in
what
general?
are the other things apart from the styling? Because you mentioned like look better looking stuff is one of the thing on the roadmap.
Yeah, yeah. Let me look at my documents so I can find information. I mean, I think it's more of a sum of things. But I think basically all the kind of lower level systems uh, needs refreshing. All the kind of very low level layer of ImGui, which is kind of the internal API, where, for example, the button code call a function called item size, item add, and this low level system. Um, there's a big refresh that's needed, and this big refresh will allow more things to happen eventually. Um, the problem with the big refresh of low-level system is that I need to make it happen in a way that will not break too much for all the custom widget that happens. Um, But I think once I do this big refresh, there will be lots more kind of layout things that will be possible to do. I mean, and basically, there's a few function calls that are very simple. If I change them, it will be possible, for example, to make a UI editor where, for example, you have an ImGui thing that's emitted by code, right? And you click an edit button, and you take a button, you can move it around and store that in a sort of kind of like, you can sort of adjust the layout of things and size of things and styling of things. I could totally have a system where you start from widget that emitted by code, but you can have a kind of an authoring tools, right? That's sort of offline and store the data so that kind of designer can say, okay, I want to make this UI look like this or that. That's totally possible. That's technically possible. That's quite easy to do, but that require me to change the signature of a few lower level functions, for example. So when I do these changes, I want to be able to ship the proof of concept for kind of like tools like that. That probably I won't finish myself, but I want people to kind of like envision that this is possible. You can make a kind of a graphical editor to shuffle things around, even though the UI is emitted by code. You could totally have a thing that override positions or stylings of things, uh, which is makes it closer to fancier UI toolkit. And this is not actually my goal to ship that thing, not my priority. But I just want to do enough to show people that it's possible. I want to make the proof of concept that it's possible. Then I will let people make it happen, because that would be separate tools basically. The same way, for example, I guess 10 years ago, somebody asked, can we create a node editor with ImGui, right? And I just made a very little prototype in, I think, 3 hours, a very hacky thing that knows that you could move around, click on them, at little kind of like, connections. It was very simple, but I just kind of like spawned it. I just fed the seed for people to develop kind of like fancy version of that. I know the kind of full-blown third-party extension that do the kind of like node editor. Uh, I went on a tangent here because I was
No, no,
saying
no.
there's lot of low-level system like all the text rendering function makes kind of like text alignment is difficult. Ellipses are kind of like a bit kind of like on a case-by-case basis. Um, this is the kind of thing I want to rewrite. I want to finish working on kind of DPI or scaling in general. It really has improved in the last few versions, but it's not kind of fully done now. Um, I want to mostly rewrite the docking system. So famously, the docking system of ImGui is in a separate branch, and it has been in a branch for like 7 years, maybe 8 years now, right?
You keep
So people are like,
updating the
why?
branch. You keep it like
Yes, I mean it's the branches they're just cross merged, right? So actually they're not that diverging, right? It's just that I wrote the first version of docking that I never shipped because it had too many issues, and then I wrote a second version of docking. This is the one I shipped, right? But I know for a fact that the code for it's too complicated right now. It's too complex. And I know because I've got many feature requests that are not easy to solve for me yet in the current kind of architecture of the thing. Um, and for some reason, I decided that not merging that as part of master would make it easier for me the day I write a V3 of that feature, right? So for that weird reason, I know it's I want to still keep the master branch a blank slate that doesn't have this code, the docking code that I think is a mess. So it's been a separate branch. But the reality of it is that all the big teams have been using this branch in general, right? And they're not diverging because the thing I do is that I keep them in the thing, if I make a change, if I make a shallow looking change to docking or add helpers or I refactor something, all the chain will go back in master. So actually if you diff master and docking, the change are pretty neat. They're just mm, isolated to docking stuff, which sort of annoy me to see exactly what the docking stuff is. Um, and just that I feel if docking was merged into master, it would take much more courageous to write it in context rather than if it's removed. But it's a bit arbitrary because probably I could decide to just delete the code and rewrite it, but it feels like
But at this point,
not merging it,
at this point,
not merging it,
if
yeah.
people are using it, what's the difference of it being not in master?
It's just that I have a version of the code that's not corrupted
Corrupted.
by 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 the code I don't like.
Okay.
But I mean, it's a bit silly. I know it's a bit silly. But the two features in docking branch are docking a multi-view port, and they're two features that people love and use. But I'm really not happy with the code base for it, so I sort of want to write them, and I'm sort of keeping this kind of like pristine version of the code that doesn't have those things. But uh, it doesn't cost me much to update this branch, to be honest, right? It's just that people find it odd because it is odd that it's two branches for 8 years. But the truth is that they're very easy to merge for me right now. It's not so very complex. But that's a bit arbitrary, right? I mean, I don't know. Anyway, I want to write that. Uh, I want to write a text editor. It's horrible.
Text editor.
Well, the what I call input text, which is kind of the multi-line text editor,
Okay.
right? It's I because I wrote before that. It's the third time I write a text editor. I wrote a Q game and I wrote it before that because I mean, if we look at my career before, I made a Sega 8-bit emulator was sort of called Mecha in '99 on MS-DOS, and it's kind of like its big feature at the time. It had a graphical user interface, and it had a little debugger for the emulator, and I had a text editor. So I wrote text editor many times. But the one in ImGui, for some reason, I used STB text edit, which is one of the uh,
Sean Barrett libraries.
yes uh, single header one. And somehow I don't think it has been a good idea to use it because it's like half of the code is on my side, half of the code is on the other side, due to many reasons, and it's being a bit of a kind of a open mess or whatever. So that's something I want to write. Um, the difficulty is to kind of like find the right scope for it because a text editor, you can take it as far as you want. You can write Sublime text, and then it's a 10 years project by itself, right? And this is not the goal of ImGui. But I want to write a new one that is more easy to plug things in or for people to modify. And basically, I've been accumulating feature requests. And I've got lots of notes about what the kind of sweet spot text editor must be. And eventually I will write it. And it won't be that much work, to be honest. But I need to find a sweet spot so that people can plug in things and have the kind of the core feature they want out of the box and can add more features. But that's something I want to write. Um, so what I say, docking, the viewport system I want to write, the text editor I want to write, and then I want to add layered features. And the the example I gave of providing this proof of concept where you can take a widget and move it with a mouse to create an authoring tool for it is one example of how layout should be, but basically I want to write the layout system in a way that it's much more easier to kind of align stuff or do kind of left to right layout, left to right alignment, have widgets that are resizable by default and stuff like that. And again, it's not like there's one thing to do, it's more like making a bunch of changes without breaking existing API too much, and that's the difficulty basically, right? All those things, if they were out of the box, they would be 10 times faster, right? If I, know that I have the experience, especially I have the experience from all the mistakes I made and all the feedback of what people want to happen. I could make that happen from scratch much better. And it's tempting, and sometimes I've been tempted to say, hey, I could write an ImGui v2 that's just delete all the code and write everything from scratch. The problem is that when you do that, you have like what I call second system syndrome, is that you have a tendency where you want to fix everything, right? Suddenly you want to fix too much, and suddenly the scope of the thing becomes like 10 times more complex, and then you end up into this kind of never-ending project where it takes 10 years to transition, right? Like Python 2 versus
Oh yeah.
Python 3. I don't know. I never wrote Python, but it looks like the transition took 10 years, right? And I guess if I rewrote ImGui from scratch, uh, first I would be concerned about dropping support for current version, which I would still take energy. And then I would be concerned that, I would sort of like embark in a new kind of 10 years journey or something with no escape left from it. So, um, anyway, I think it's more interesting to keep the existing code and improve it over time. But this is why the change are kind of like uh, harder to make. But I think I've achieved a little miracle in the sense that GRMQ today is much more powerful than 10 years ago, and many things sort of evolves behind the scene in a kind of subtle way with very kind of like well-planed breakages that have been, decently accepted. Uh, and it takes like crazy kind of amount of planning and engineering for the things to not break too much,
Do
um,
you get any help?
using.
Do you get any help from people, contributors?
So I had someone I could hire. I had someone part-time for 3 years called Rokas. Um, his nickname on Twitter is Rokups. Uh, I don't know if I pronounced that well. He helped me for 3 years part-time. Um, Most of his work was around writing regression tests for the test engine. But what we found while writing tests, every time what happened we write a test is that we learn on kind of like unspecified behaviors, and then we end up discovering bugs or kind of adding new features. So you start by writing this test. I want to write the test for the button, and then you end up writing 6 features for the button or whatever. What always happen? I had this guy helping for 3 years, and he was paid from the sort of extra money I got from sponsors. Otherwise, it's on GitHub. Uh, I get lots of help in the sense that people have been updating a lot and reporting when there's bugs and asking for features. Uh, I get lots of help in the form of pull requests. The problem with pull requests is that they're almost never right. It's almost all the time. The problem is correct. People have a problem. They have a real problem, right? And they want to solve it, and they make change in the code that solve their problem, but they don't realize that they break five other things, or sometimes the change is not efficient enough, which is often the case, right? People make code that is not efficient enough. So most of the time, the pull request, they point to the problem, but the solution is not right, and I have to rewrite it. And I suspect that many times, people make a pull request, maybe they spend three hours on it, and I spend 20 hours in finishing the thing so that it kind of ships in a way that makes sense with the overall API design and with performances. So they help. Um, I would say they rarely help enough, but people still help a lot. Through just even if they complain or submit a pull request that I can't merge a single line of. Usually the pull request is there for a reason, so there's a good reason for it, and this is helpful, right? And there's ongoing communication, and Um, but you know, 95% of the code is probably mine in the code base still.
So we were talking about your
Yeah.
contributions and then pull requests sometimes being rejected, which reminded me to ask you about your C++ style and generally development style. Like, what
Okay.
do you enjoy C++ modern programming and like STD views and everything that is happening with the
I
new
I
stuff?
I
Or like,
I don't even know what an STD view is. I mean, I don't enjoy modern C++. I don't even know modern C++. As I mentioned, I have this habit of not. I mean, I love programming, right? But I'm more of a product person rather than a technical person who's kind of like obsessed by the ins and outs of programming. And as a result, I just, you know, I don't keep up to date with what C++ does, right? Because it didn't feel like a pragmatic thing to pursue. As a result, I don't even know what STD view is, right? And I don't even know what the difference between an STD set or STD hash or map or is, right? I sort of like vaguely know these things, and I could probably understand what it refers to, but I don't really understand what these names specifically refers to in terms of algorithm or kind of like storage thing. So no, my C++ is very simple. It's uh, uh, I mean, ImGui is loose function, so it's technically C style, even if it's in a namespace. I use a few C++ feature. I use operator overloading for kind of like vector math. Um, I use templates a little bit for kind of like low-level data structures, such as my implementation of vectors, stuff like that. Um, uh, Everything is public, struct. I don't use encapsulation in ImGui at least. I sort of learned, that it was a little bullshit. But I add comments in the code. I say, hey, this is private internal. You're not supposed to touch that, right? But I want to add honey odd barrier by just marking the thing as private. Uh, I use inheritance once in the code base, but it's in the internal code. It's not in the public code. Um, so it's very simple C++. Nowadays, I have to be considerate of the fact also that, GIMQ has bindings for like, I forgot, 20 language or whatever, many languages,
yeah.
right? They're more or less complex binding. Uh, but the more C++, fancy C++ you are, the less kind of like uh, it makes sense to adopt in different languages, right? So I guess my style today would be very close to C with sort of like some added feature. Like I use default parameters, I use function overloading. But to be honest, even function overloading that I used a few times, I sort of regret it now. I feel like it's especially it makes awkward API when it translates to different languages. Um,
What would you do instead? Like a flags thing to catch, bundle some parameters
uh,
or different names?
I don't know. Yeah, I guess it's case by case basis. I guess it would be either different names, either function, either flags. I don't think there's a single answer to it, but I had notes.
You
Let me look at
noted
my
down.
notes.
You mentioned
Yeah,
most, I think, because I also see your
yeah,
notes. Uh,
yeah.
but you say here in the notes, Boolean arguments are the worst, and I think there's a
Oh yeah.
story here.
Uh, I mean, I've heard that a few times. It's just in my experience, every time I added initially in the API a parameter with a bool, like enable sub feature or whatever, or it just ended up being um, difficult to improve the API over time.
Interesting.
Uh, and confusing to use because if you have two bools in the function parameters, false, true, true, false, whatever. It's just really confusing to use, right? And I've noticed effectively that many of the bools I had initially in like V1 API has sort of been removed over time. Unless, if it's a bool for a checkbox, it makes sense, right? The checkbox hold the bool. But I mean, bools as a way to kind of configure what a function is doing. And effectively, I've been using flags a lot, named flags in ImGui, which is basically uh, compact bools that have names, right? It's just that the bools parameters, um, you don't see the name in the call site. Uh, so it's just very difficult to read the code. And I guess I transitioned them most to flags by now. Uh,
So no inheritance. Everything is public. If something is private, it's more like comment
yeah,
instead of like an enforcement.
yeah,
Do you use
yeah.
classes that much or structs?
Uh, so I actually for draw list, everything is called struct. I mean, I could use class public. I guess when you use struct, it's just convey the point that this is kind of no bullshit C style, right? Uh,
Serious programming.
uh, but I use method in a few places, and ImDrawList in particular use methods. So ImDrawList it's a struct, but it has methods, right? Whereas ImGui API is loose function in an ImGui namespace. Um, the problem I found with methods is that it makes it very awkward to extend the API, right? Because the official way, in C++ way, would be to kind of like um, iterate from the class and add new methods.
Yes.
But if you do that, you also have to hook and be able to control where the instance are created, which means a bunch of machinery, and it's just awkward. So the easiest, if you want to add new function to ImDrawList nowadays, it's awkward because you cannot. Whereas for ImGui is a namespace, right? You can in your own source file, you can create a function that lives in ImGui namespace if you want. So that function call can have a consistent kind of a calling style with other function. That's possible. For ImDrawList, you're forced to create a loose function that take the ImDrawList parameter as an explicit dispointer rather than an implicit one. And that's awkward because it makes the coding style different. If you have a function calling method and then a loose function with string parameter, it just looks different. The discoverability of them is different. This is very awkward. What's frustrating is that technically speaking, it wouldn't be so hard for C++ compiler could have a way to add method from outside a class definition. There's nothing preventing it as long as they're not virtual method. If you had a virtual method, which I don't use, they need to be part of a vtable. They need to be initialized in the when you construct the instance. But regular C++ methods that you don't inherit are not virtual. They're just regular loose function with an implicit dis parameter. Technically, the compiler, if C++ flag loaded, they're never gonna know how to load because they sort of break encapsulation. But they could have had a way to say, hey, I want to amend this class and add a method to it. I think it would be nice things in terms of extension, but it's not possible right now. So I use that for drawList. I use that for a few helpers like my vector class or a few kind of lower level kind of like helper structs. I use methods. I find them convenient because basically code is a little shorter when you use methods. Because when you use C style loose function, effectively the function name usually has a prefix as the type, right? Because if you don't do that, then your function have crazy names that conflict with other classes, other types. So effectively, the name of the type is part of the function name, and then you have to add the name of your instances to the call. Um, so it's a little longer, but I think it's worth it. So I guess if I had to redesign the API, maybe the drawList API would be loose function, and drawList would be a parameter, explicit parameter rather than a disk pointer, because it makes extending it a little kind of less awkward. Um, but that's it. I don't use C++ a lot, not more than that. Uh,
I,
yeah,
I talked to Anton recently, and he kind
yeah,
of sort of threw around this idea of like to think about programmers and your style of programming as coming from like a lineage of something, right? Like, for example,
yeah,
Casey Muratori made Handmade Hero, and a lot of people got influenced by it. And there is sort of like a lineage of like Casey style
yeah,
C, C++ thing.
yeah,
There are people coming from demo scene, and
yeah.
they have like they write code differently because they just were
Mhm,
trained on like different kind of systems. Uh,
mhm.
how would you categorize this lineage for you? Was it like
My,
your own Omar lineage, Omar C?
I guess I've learned from, I worked in different places. I worked in a company. The first company I worked on in France was called Unitero. Then I worked on my own code base for a game called Soul Bubbles. Then I worked at Q Games. Then I worked in Media Molecule. Then I guess I've learned from different people. I would call it pragmatic C++. Um, but that said, I want to say that I mean the way I write ImGui is not necessarily the way I would write my own sort of
Oh,
like
really?
software, right? I mean ImGui is a library. It's meant to use by lots of people. It's meant to sort of have a stable API over many years. It's meant to be used by from different languages, right? Uh, if I were to write my own game today, I would probably use inheritance, and if not crazy amount of inheritance, but I would probably use virtual function here and there for whatever it just makes sense for, Uh, um, it happens. I have to admit that there are a few cases in JMG where I wanted to use something and it made more sense, and I didn't use it, especially inheritance, because I didn't use it because it conveys. I think people have strong opinion on things very fast. They look at the JMQ header, it looks a certain way, right? And there are places where if I added inheritance in this place, even if it made sense, I think people would feel, oh, this is a C++ library. And they kind of heuristic triggers. They say, they're going to associate the fact that I used inheritance in that place with, the bad experience they had with 10 other pieces of code using fancy C++. And it's gonna affect the judgment of the library. So there's a few points in time where I didn't use inheritance just because I didn't want to look too C++ because it would affect people's judgment. But people's judgment is important because they also affect kind of the I mean, it's a slippery slope. If you're starting using that feature, then you're gonna add more of it, and it's going to snowball into something that could be out of control. Actually, I'm glad I'm using inheritance in the public API because it's sort of harder to convey it in different languages on language binding for different languages. So the fact that I don't use it makes it much easier to adapt IMG to other languages. I just checked actually this 27 language binding
Nice.
apparently. It's more or less complete, more or less updated, but that's
Who's
something.
maintaining them?
Uh,
Authors of
different,
bindings or you?
yeah, yeah, no, no, out of bindings. I don't maintain any language binding. I haven't used them actually, any of them. So maybe I should at some point to get something. But I get feedback. I tend to like be I'm stalking other people's code bases and feedback and GitHub repo to sort of get a feel of what I can improve on my end.
Have you tried
Uh,
using different programming languages? There are a couple of newer, low-level systems programming languages like Odin, Zig, Hare.
I haven't. I haven't. I guess partly it's because I'm just too full of things to do. I mean, I've got this. I've got different hobbies, and I guess as I said, I'm sort of like. I guess I was always a product person. I was always obsessed by the end result of what I did, which is usually game. I know it's in library, but I don't care so much about the way of doing programming, and I sort of like that C in C++. The way I use it is fairly simple and straightforward to do it. For me, it's it's also my comfort zone, and maybe that's not a good thing, but it's what I'm comfortable with. Somehow I don't feel the need, or I don't have the time and energy to sort of look at other things. I would probably learn things. I guess the thing I regret the most is not learning Python. I sort of avoiding learning Python just because, I never had the occasion of. And usually when I write small tools, I write them in C or C++, which is quite non-efficient, right? I mean, I've used Perl and C Sharp occasionally here and there at school, PHP, stuff like that, but not very seriously. But I haven't tried Odin, Zig, Rust, very much.
Okay.
I don't know if it's a good thing or. I mean, I haven't tried even modern C++ a lot, right? So, uh,
No, I don't think it's like a value judgment, whether it's a good or bad thing. It's just
no,
out of
no, no, no. It's just
curiosity.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. No, but my answer is I haven't really.
And
Yeah.
what code editor do you use?
I use Visual Studio.
Okay.
I've been Visual Studio forever. Yeah,
Okay.
I've been.
That's the game development lineage right there.
Uh, yes, I guess it is. Yes, effectively, yeah, yeah. But I think I've been using it even before. I mean, my first home project, I think, were on not my first one, but I think I switched to Visual Studio even before I worked with other people at a job. It just sort of made sense for me, and I'm using latest version. I'm fairly happy with it. I mean, considering it's free, or at least I use it for free. Uh, uh, you know, I'm just disappointed that debuggers have been improving a lot. They've been very stagnant, at least in Visual Studio, right? Debug. I wish you could just program the shit out of your debugger very easily. It's not possible yet. And hopefully the new debuggers will allow this. But I haven't used them too much because I don't know, I like the convenience that I mean I debug a lot. I like the convenience that I can put breakpoint in my code and just debug it. And I don't like using different tools for it. But I guess eventually, stuff like RAD debugger will be attractive enough that I will use them. Uh, I should probably spend more time trying those tools.
Eventually, Ryan is gonna be like, okay, let's add code editor to RAD debugger, and he will turn it into like an IDE, and it'll be like, okay, there's no.
Maybe. I assume there's tools today to synchronize breakpoints and stuff like that. I guess it's just momentum. I'm not used to it. Um, I mean, one day there was a day where I started using a remedy debugger for a bit, but it didn't have syntax highlighting for some reason. I didn't like it because of that. It just my eyes knitted, right? So I stopped using it. Um, uh, but this is what I miss the most from Visual Studio. It's just a better debugger. I think the watch window is horrible. And I know that the watch window in RAD debugger and remedy debugger are better.
Now, we talked about how Dear ImGui looks. We talked about how it looks inside. We talked about the future plans. We didn't touch that much on performance. So should we close out with a little bit of mention of like how would you rate, like judge Dear ImGui performance? Like, could it be better? Is it good enough? how like immediate, like are there different like tiers for performance if you use immediate mode GUI versus retained mode GUI? How do you look at the performance of the ImGui?
I think the sort of the advantage of a IMGui system where you keep resubmitting things that you have to make things performant, right? Uh, uh, it's been a problem, not a problem, but it's been decent work to just ensure things are performant. Usually, when I write a feature, I always kind of like, I guess, I think of term of what data I need to be touched to make that thing happen, and I sort of design the data structure from it. And I'm always maybe overly paranoid about performances, but what I've seen is that I mean, people throw a lot of shit at AMD, throw a lot of stuff, right? They've got AAA game engine, they just loop on their I don't know 2,000 active actors, and they just send stuff to AMGUI. And I don't want the engine to come to a crawl because of that, right? So every time I design something, I look at the case of, hey, there's going to be 10,000 of this submitted, and I want this to have a minimal impact, especially because AAA, you uh, usually they kind of like very expensive title, and during development they're not optimized, so they're kind of slower than they would be. So I don't want GMG to be wasting 3 milliseconds of their frame budget, right? So it needs to be under the things, and I'm very considerate of that. I'm very considerate of the fact that things needs to be fast in debug mode, aka non-optimized builds. That's something that the C++ crowd doesn't care about, but uh, when you debug a game, uh, I mean, you want to be able to debug your game. You want to be able to step through non-optimized code, and I'm trying to be considerate of the fact that if the code is not optimized enough by the compiler, it's gonna be not extremely slow. Meaning stuff like, for example, excessive number of kind of like inlining or function hoops or things that have a little cost in debug builds. I'm always kind of worried to kind of make that optimal enough. Meaning that usually when I profile JMGUI, I profile both kind of debug builds and release builds. So I look at the performance of debug
Okay.
builds, uh, and if I had a feature, sometimes I optimize things just for debug builds, right? A lot. Um, because, I mean, in theory, on a nice build system, you could say, okay, this library is going to be compiled in release mode, or with tools like Live C++, you can unoptimize one piece of file, which is very convenient because it means the rest of your engine can run in kind of optimized mode. But small project usually they just build everything simple, but they just build everything with the same settings, right? And I don't want people building ImGui in debug mode to have like slow performances. So also optimize for that. Also, sometimes occasionally, even if you can, if you have a hard to debug engine bug, you're gonna want to build everything in debug build or whatever. I just want things to be performant enough. I don't want ImGui to be a reason for something to slow down in the engine. Um, I took the habit of aiming at an average of 0 allocation per frame. So basically, the rule of thumb is that an idle frame of ImGui never allocates anything, never calls like a heap allocator like malloc on the idle frame. It should never do that. It only allocates when there's growth of thing. When you create a new window, when you add new content, you need more vertices or whatever, it will grow buffers, but it's trying to be zero lock on a typical frame. Um,
Does it
which
constrain you in terms of like,
a lot,
yeah,
a lot, but I mean, it takes more time to develop things. But basically, you can just create buffer, amortize them, and reuse them, right? It adds a little, um, it's extra work basically. Uh, I think it's also same because if you use ImGui to be debugging, I mean, its purpose is to be debugging games, right? Game engine. You don't want your tooling, your tools to be interfering with the game engine too much, right? If IMG kept allocating things, it would just by nature would create a lot of side effects in the game engine. So if you're debugging something and your tools create side effect, then probably it's going to be hard to debug some hard stuff, right? So the fact that it allocates fairly rarely kind of reduce the odds that it will interfere with whatever else you're doing, right? Um, so that's sort of one rule of thumbs. I don't allocate. Let me look at my notes. What I do. Yeah, I said I optimize for debug mode a lot. Uh, yeah, I think that's the thing. But I spend a lot of time optimizing for things, basically. I never like, I'm very reluctant to use, if I know one feature can be accomplished by just doing this and that, touching this bit of data and this bit of data, I'm usually very reluctant to take a shortcut to say it's going to be doing twice the amount of work or whatever. I'm always kind of aiming for like whatever is the minimum amount of like data fetch and transform that need to happen for this to work, and I sort of like design the data structure for it. The one other thing I do is that I'm very conscious of I mean basic performance 101 is that RAM is very slow. L3 cache is a little faster, L2 cache is faster, L1 cache is faster, and register are faster. And I've developed a game on the Nintendo DS called Soul Bubbles 15 years ago that was very taxing for the DS because it's a kind of physics-based game in a kind of vectors-based environment. Um, and I remember going to GDC in 2003 and I saw Christer Eriksson talk about memory, performance, and cache stuff. And I feel like I've learned the main thing I need to learn about, efficient programming in this talk, basically, because it hasn't changed much. And I'm always kind of like wary of kind of like data quality. And if I know this algorithm is going to touch this data very often or that data less often, I'm going to just split this thing and kind of like, this is hot data, cold data. The idea being that the amount of memory your code is accessing is kind of a decent approximation of the at least for what I'm doing of the performances. So I'm very aware of this. Um,
Nice.
I had a different thing to think about, but I forgot. I had an idea. Yeah. Yeah.
That's awesome.
So performance is quite a thing I spend time on, to be honest. Um, that ironically, I almost never got complaint about performances.
Ironically,
Uh,
I would say
well,
we can see why if you do like a lot of the designs from the sort of
yeah, but
calculations.
you could argue that maybe I'm preemptively optimizing things, because I don't wait for people to complain to optimize things. But um, I don't know. It just makes sense for me this way, right? Um, Especially because this kind of like always refreshing IMGui style thing. People have been constantly hammering again. Uh, Half of the internet is just keep saying I'm good as slow, I'm good as slow, right? Because they just keep submitting. So great. Of course, in theory, you have to reduce things so they think it's slower. Uh, it just forces you to optimize things, basically, right? And the thing about retain mode UI is that they tend to be optimal when you're doing nothing, but as soon as you start just moving things around, resizing things, and just the amount of kind of like memory and CPU uses skyrockets. Whereas in ImGui, it's kind of like fairly, um, eh, it's basically always running a worst case scenario, meaning you have to optimize for that. And then I haven't even added like official way to do the idle thing where you just stop updating things when you don't move the mouse or stuff like that. People have been doing this. It's easy to do, but eventually I will add sort of an official way to do this, and um, it will be a little better by default.
Nice. Omar, have we reached the end?
You decide.
Now tell me, and
Okay.
everybody who is listening,
Oh,
um,
yeah.
if somebody would like to help, would you prefer them to do a pull request, find an issue, or sponsor the project, or like decide that for the next 3 years they want to contribute to the ImGui and like become a paid contributor? Like, what would be the way to support your work if anybody from the listeners would
Well, the
like
two
to?
different. I mean, a code contribution. I mean, community contribution, founding are just very two different things in the sense that I mean, you can do either or you can do both depending on your situation. Founding wise, I prefer big companies to be founding or companies that have the means to rather than individuals. I accept, things from individuals and donation, but overall, I found that it's just healthier and better to get funding from companies. If you work for a company that uses ImGui, literally the best thing to do is to contact me first so I can talk to you and explain to you the best way to fund ImGui because I found that programmers, when they talk internally, before talking to me, they use a language and they carry a narrative that will makes it harder for the company to fund me. Like in companies, if you start talking about donation, for example, you don't get any money because they just, if whereas if you present it in a different way, it's easier to get funding.
Is this
Um,
would this be good to share on the podcast?
in what way?
Like, would it be okay for you to share what you usually say to those people? How to like do it properly? Or is it better not to say it because it's for
Uh,
reasons? It's fine either
it's
way.
not, no, it's for reason, but the main reason is that it's always better to have a one-on-one conversation with people because I like to understand how they're using it, why they're using it.
Okay.
I'd like them to understand I can help them and I can, if they have question, can help. So it's always better to have a little conversation, even if it's informal first. And I'm always happy to have conversation with teams, even if it doesn't lead to founding, uh, you know, to get how they're using the library. So just getting in touch, even before knowing if it's a possibility to found something, is usually what I would advise. And you can find my contact. There's a funding page. There's my email address, whatever. You can reach me, and I'm happy to talk to you if you're using it. That's one thing. Code-wise, code-wise, it's tricky. I don't want people to contribute for the sake of contributing, right?
Yeah.
I think if you start from the angle of say, I want to contribute to this project, you're not gonna find the right problem to solve. I think it's better when you when you start from your own problems. So I think the need and the desire to contribute will come from your actual real life experience of stumbling on something, right? Um, my biggest plea is that if people want to help, um, it's always better if people can spend the time to look at the details, right, and take care of the details, right, than just like um, uh, crack up some code. I mean, this is not solvable as basically I'm hoping that people would just think about all the design possibilities and problematic and problems that are and solutions, and but most people, they want to solve the problem as fast as they can, right? And usually doing so they create other problems, and therefore I can't merge the thing. um, the problem, if you ask of people to spend lots of time contributing, then they won't. So I don't think there's a right approach to that. I think I just need to, on a case by case basis, when somebody comes on GitHub and their contribution are good, I will try to encourage them. Obviously, I would answer them faster. I would give them better answer to sort of to encourage them to stick around. Because the longer someone sticks around, um, the sort of the better the contribution are to the project usually. Whereas the average tourist would just, the passerby, it's normal, right? This is not your project. If you want to fix a bug, you're gonna just make whatever you think is the
Yeah.
right fix, and you're gonna run away and leave me with it. But the thing is that even if that's annoying for me, this is still the best things to do for you, and by doing so, you kind of like contribute the feedback that there's a problem that I need to solve, even if your solution is not the right one. So I think the all the frustrating aspect of my job, which is to feel that I'm always kind of like cleaning behind people and janitoring, this is just a necessary evil, and there's no way around it. It's because I'm sort of in the front line with technical support, and I'm sort of finishing the work that people are starting, that the project is getting somewhere, right? I can't be reasonably asking people to do the job that I'm doing because it's not a project. They don't have as much time to invest in it. I can only find depending on the type of contribution and people, I try to kind of like, sometimes it's easier for me to redo the thing. Sometimes when I see the person is good enough, I would sort of like give them the feedback to fix it. It's always kind of a bet to make on my end. Um, but any contribution is helpful, even if it's frustrating for me, even if it's unfinished or broken. It's usually helpful because when you ask the question, it will probably relate to the problem that other people have. So, I mean, don't hesitate to contribute. Even if I rewrite the PR, it's probably useful that you did it, right?
Okay.
Um, I don't know if that made sense.
Okay. Awesome. Omar,
Yeah.
thank you so much for the discussion.
Thanks, thanks for having me. I hope it made some sense for listener. We'll find out.
And if you're listening and you didn't check out Dear ImGui, please do. There's also an awesome write-up with a lot of cool pictures and screenshots and numbers that are just like
Yes.
mind-blowing in the post called 10 Years
Yeah.
of Dear ImGui. Highly recommend this one. And follow Omar on X.
And Blue Sky and whatever else. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And wait, maybe hopefully to 10 more years of IMGA. Of dear IMGA.
To,
See,
to 10
I keep
years.
forgetting the dear myself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.